Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. This is a webinar that is co-hosted by the Break Exchange and the Arch National Respite Network. And I know Jill Kagan, who is the director of the Arch National Respite Network, is here with us. So Jill, I don't know if you want to take a moment just to say hi from Arch or say anything about Arch for those who may not be familiar with the network before I talk about the Break Exchange.
Thank you, Kim. I'd love to just say hi. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us, and we're really pleased and excited to be co-hosting this event with the Break Exchange. They've been fantastic partners on expanding the issue of respite globally. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Kim.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. And then I'll introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Kim Whitmore, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Wisconsin-Madison here in the United States. And I am the current director of the Break Exchange, and really glad to have you all here as well. I'm going to just share a couple of slides to remind everyone what the Break Exchange is in case there's new people to the group. And then we will turn it over to our webinar presenters. So the Break Exchange, it stands for Building Respite Evidence and Knowledge, and this is an international group of individuals that make up a broad range of different disciplines, but primarily researchers and respite agencies that are really committed to building that culture of evidence-based respite care and promoting that and learning from and with each other globally. The Break Exchange was founded with some incredible partners. So we're really fortunate to have the partnership of the Arch National Respite Network and Resource Center here in the United States, as well as Shared Care Scotland, the School of Nursing where I sit, as well as the International Short Break Association, or ISBA. I can't mention ISBA without reminding everyone that our ISBA conference is coming up in June. It is going to be a virtual conference because of COVID. And if you aren't already registered, really encourage you to check out the website. Our program and keynote information is up there, and it's going to be just an excellent conference. So encourage you to take a look. We have close to 300 people registered from, I want to say, 17 different countries right now, roughly, and growing. So really going to be a great conference with lots of learning. So real quickly, the benefits of joining the Break Exchange. If you're not already signed up and receiving our monthly e-newsletters, we encourage you to do so. There's lots of benefits to being a part of the exchange. The ability to connect with this global network of researchers, providers, agencies, and other individuals is one of the main benefits. We currently have, as of today, 189 members from 15 different countries that have signed up for the Break Exchange. This is an opportunity to learn from and with each other about evidence-based respite practices and research that's happening around the world, and also share your own work, like presenting at a webinar, like today's webinar, or featuring your work in our e-newsletter, and we can help push that out through our social media networks as well. So really want you to use this as a platform to share the work that you're involved in. And then one of the best benefits, I think, is the potential for the Break Exchange to connect people for collaboration opportunities. So we really want to help identify programs that are research ready and help them connect with researchers and evaluators to really continue to grow the projects and evidence base that is out there around respite care. So there's ways to use the exchange to identify those partners. You can fill out a member profile and search our searchable database to try to find people with similar interests. So if you haven't already completed your member profile or checked out our member database, we encourage you to do that as well. So this slide just has all the different ways you can stay connected to the Break Exchange. We're on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We have a website that you can join our listserv and look at the member profile as well. If you have any questions, you can always reach out via email to us anytime. So with that being said, I am going to stop my share, and I'm going to turn the wheel over to our amazing presenters here. We're so grateful to have a team of people from CARES New South Wales and Australia joining us. So those of you who are joining me from the US, it's 6 o'clock at night where I am, and it's bright and early in the morning for them tomorrow. So we appreciate the flexibility and the time, and just so glad to have them here today. So I'm going to let them tell you more about who they are and the work that they do, and just want to thank them for being here today to present to all of you.
Thanks very much, Kim, for that glowing introduction. And I'll just set up our slides. Just bear with me. Hopefully it works as planned. Okay, is that all good? Everyone can see those? Fantastic. Okay, so as Kim mentioned, we're in some different time zones, which is always exciting and a little confusing. It's just after 9 a.m. here in Sydney, where we are. And so I guess it's a good evening to those joining us from the United States and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, and a good morning to any other Down Under colleagues who may be chiming in, since it is sort of within our working day here. My name's Sarah Judd-Lamb, and I manage the policy and research team here at Carers New South Wales. And I'll also be presenting with my two colleagues, Dr. Lucas Hofstadter and Melissa Docker, who are online as well, and we'll be sharing the presentation today. I mentioned to Kim earlier, we're presenting from our office in North Sydney, and we're very lucky in Australia to be having a pretty good time with COVID. We've got very low cases and sort of circulating a lot, and it's fairly back to normal in terms of working and commuting. So we're all full-time in the office, but we're just in different rooms so that we can participate a bit more easily in the webinar. So today we'll be speaking to you about some of the challenges and opportunities for the respite sector that have been presenting themselves in the Australian context, particularly in the last decade. And as care services here have been undergoing a major shift from the sort of block-funded, more constrained rationed model to more consumer-directed models, which I know is not unique and has really been happening everywhere. And we're really excited to be presenting these findings for the first time in an international context. And obviously there's similar work going on in other countries. The Break Exchange, is great at leading the international connection of these different networks, but it's just clear looking at Arch and Break Exchange's work how much the issue of prioritising evidence-based respite is a real priority internationally. So we're really pleased to be able to contribute to this, and thank you to both Arch and the Break Exchange for giving us the opportunity to present today. And I should also just have a disclaimer that if there's some different pronunciation or spelling or terminology, I'm sure you're all used to the international context, but yes, I realise there's a lot of Australianisms probably in terms of spelling in our presentation, so please bear with us. And we tend to say respite here rather than respite, but it's a bit of a mix, so just bear with us. So one thing that's an important step in Australia that's pretty common, you may have seen that before, is acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on before we present. So here in North Sydney, we acknowledge the Gurrabal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And in the context of today's webinar, we also extend that respect to First Nations peoples from the countries represented among attendees, and to any joining us today. Briefly about Carers New South Wales. So NSW is just our acronym for New South Wales and one of the states of Australia. And we are the peak non-government organisation for family and friend carers in New South Wales. And you will see Australia in our logo, but that just indicates that we're part of something called the National Carer Network here in Australia. And it's made up of associations like ours in each state and territory. And so that we do have a peak body at national level called Carers Australia. Oops, just went ahead too fast there. But we're all separate organisations that work together as part of a network. And Carers New South Wales, like a number of our other associations in the National Carer Network, we receive funding from both state and federal governments here to do evidence-based advocacy, essentially, to conduct research and systemic advocacy and build the capacity of carers, as well as delivering some direct services to carers in New South Wales. So one of the terminology differences, I think, between especially America and Australia is the term carer. So we sort of tend to go more towards the British language, I suppose, the UK language around caring and carers rather than caregivers. But essentially, the definition of carers here in Australia is within some legislation. And so just kind of our normal overview that we would give is that we're generally speaking about family members and friends that are caring in an unpaid informal capacity. So our definition that our organisation works with specifically excludes people that are doing caring as a paid profession or as a form of volunteering role. So we're just speaking about people that are caring for family members and friends. Did I just pause the, can you still see that? Yeah, okay. I just got a little notification. Okay, there we go. Resume share. Sorry about this, it's just doing something funny. Okay, here we go. Just to go back to the outline, we will be splitting a presentation today just between 3 pieces. I'll just provide a little bit of background around our research and the respite work that we've been doing. And then Lucas will talk about the data side and some of the surveys that we've done and some of the key results that have contributed to this project. And then Melissa has been our kind of lead paper writer for the policy paper that we're launching next Tuesday in Australia, and which we've been working on for, I think, about 4 years now. And so she'll speak more about some of the findings and recommendations from that paper and what we're going to do with that. So that's me, just my little introductory slide. So we'll get into the main content. I know some of you will have probably been to Australia. Kim, I know, has been a number of times. I may even have met some of you at the 2017 International Carers Conference that was held in Australia in Adelaide. I know I met some carer sector colleagues from the US at that time. So some of you will know this, but forgive me in providing a little bit of national background for you. So just some brief context about carers in Australia. Our overall population is about 25 million people, which is pretty low given that our continent, our landmass is about the same size as the US, probably I think about 3/4 of the size officially. And the carer population estimates place that at about 11%. So more than 1 in 10 Australians has a caring role, and that's believed to be an underestimate because of the hidden nature of caring. So 1 in 10 is a number we use a lot in Australia, and it's helpful in raising awareness. The largest proportion of Australians and also the largest proportion of carers live in our state, New South Wales, and that's largely because Sydney, the capital city of New South Wales, is a very big and well-known city. It's not our capital city, but it is our largest global city. And there are other states and territories as well, which we won't speak about, but together we make up the Australian system, and we have a federal government as well, federated system, kind of similar to the US, but different in terms of policy and politics in a number of ways. And it's always challenging to overview a whole country's system of formal care provision, especially in federal systems like the US will definitely understand, where individual jurisdictions have a lot of autonomy. So it's a complex thing. So I'll just start very briefly, which is to say that the main kind of 2 levels of government we look at with care policy and respite work is federal government or Australian government and state and territory governments. And what has been happening in the past 10 years is a major shift of a lot of care service provision funding from the state level to the federal level to improve national consistency. And so, like, very briefly, just kind of for your background, but Melissa will expand on this later in the presentation. Our federal government manages disability funding and aged care service funding, and recently, especially carer services. And the disability and aged care services are split in Australia by age at the 65-year mark. And there's a couple of other things there that the Australian government manages that are relevant. At the state level, state government is very much in charge of public health and mental health services, and some carer-specific programs are included. There are not many respite programs. Most of those have moved to national context, but there is also a lot of carer recognition, legislative and policy work that happens at the state and territory level, especially in New South Wales. And we won't get to go into any detail on that today, but it is an interesting topic, and if anyone's interested in that, happy to discuss in the question time or offline. Excuse me. So again, it's difficult to summarise some major and complex changes in brief form. So I've just thrown up here some key principles or concepts that are sort of driving the changes in the last 10 years here, as well as some of the key challenges, which I'm sure are common in other jurisdictions. And I'm not going to speak to all of them now. I just wanted to highlight, I guess, the first two key concepts of consumer-directed care and individualised funding, which I know there's different terms for in different places, but essentially the last 10 years, particularly our aged care and disability services have shifted from what was essentially a block-funded, highly rationed approach to service provision to more individualised, package-based systems that are driven more by individual needs and offering more individual choice around service types and delivery modes. A few other features of that kind of system, which would probably be similar elsewhere. In terms of issues, there's a lot of issues, as I'm sure you're also aware. But the main challenge that I wanted to highlight, and which Melissa will talk to in more depth, is the one at the bottom there, which is care recognition and inclusion. And it's definitely been the case in Australia that, and I know in overseas jurisdictions as well, definitely in the UK, that the shift to consumer-directed care, while good in a lot of ways for people receiving care, has in many ways unintentionally sidelined the needs of carers and led to a kind of erosion in carer support in a lot of contexts. And so that's really where our work comes in, is, I guess, arguing for that to be revisited, that aspect of consumer-directed care systems to be revisited to make sure that breaks are still part of that for carers. So I sort of have mentioned in the last decade, in the past 10 years, that's the main period that we're looking at in terms of reform that Melissa will detail. But in the last 1 to 2 years, there's been a huge acceleration in change and scrutiny around the reforms in Australia. It's been a very busy year or two, as our team will attest, in terms of work. So we've had 3 concurrent national inquiries into the aged care, disability and mental health systems, with huge amounts of consultation and reporting and submission writing. It's been a very exciting and kind of high scrutiny time in terms of these systems, and a great opportunity to talk about respite. So we've been really trying to leverage that with our work on respite. We've also had a brand new national carer support system launched last year, in the middle of the first COVID lockdown, which was a very interesting time. And we are actually, Carers New South Wales is one of the 10 providers of that service in Australia. So we provide that service in part of New South Wales, which gives us a really good, keeps us in touch with what's happening in that service system. And then of course, COVID, which has just complicated and just exacerbated everything, and made everything more complicated and harder. So that's another factor that of course is important and will be relevant everywhere. So leading into, I guess, just some background before the others speak to their slides. The first element that Lucas will be speaking about is our research. So I mentioned that we do evidence-based advocacy. We're specifically funded by our state government to conduct a survey every 2 years of carers, and that's been going on for some time. It's been a statewide survey just in New South Wales for many years, but in 2020, we worked together with the carer associations in the other 5 states and 2 territories to conduct it nationally. And so ordinarily we'd get around 2,000 carers in New South Wales respond. We had over 8,000 nationally, which was fantastic response. And this survey really is quite in depth, and it looks at a whole bunch of aspects of the caring role. It goes into detail about current service issues because we use it for our advocacy, and we distribute it in online and hard copy form. So Lucas will speak about the specific findings on respite, but just to give you a bit of an overview of who's responding. So I mentioned we had about over 8,000 people respond. By the time we cleaned data, we had 7,700 roughly valid responses from across Australia. As you can see from the map there of Australia, it's pretty evenly distributed in that we got people from kind of all over Australia, but the red spots and orange spots there are where we got some more concentrated response rates, and that's basically just a feature of the very passionate care associations representatives we had in those regions, really pushing the survey and being very connected with their networks. but we did get carers from all over. And just some little demographic stats there. The main point of providing that table is really just to compare our survey data to the sample that our Australian Bureau of Statistics has for the survey that they do every 3 years and it's called the Survey of Disability, Ageing and Carers. So that's a specific national survey that is more representative and that you can see there that the population distribution, the demographics are a bit different, which just means that our findings, while not representative of all carers in Australia, are still very useful and indicative, especially around areas that are not covered in the population data, such as service access and the finer points of wellbeing. So moving on to the Carer Respite Alliance, which Melissa will talk about in more detail. Similar to the Break Exchange, which we were just hearing from Kim before, sort of developed over a couple of years, started it out as a concept, then became kind of a reality and has really been focused on evidence-based advocacy as well. The Carer Respite Alliance, the idea was generated in sort of 2015, 2016, but it sort of came formally to fruition in 2017. And it really was an effort on behalf of Carers New South Wales and a couple of our other key stakeholders that were doing research on respite and felt that the importance of respite was being forgotten and ignored by policymakers, and that we were concerned about the direction things were going in. So we felt we needed to combine our evidence to have a united advocacy voice. So we have a network that was set up in 2017 that is a combination of other peak body representatives, researchers, and also some service provider representatives, people that really do have expertise in this area and wanted to demonstrate to governments that respite services are still required and that they're effective. And so really our aims are just to bolster that evidence base, bring it together in Australia, and have some key messaging for governments amidst the reforms that have been ongoing. Membership, we've had a little bit of changes in membership over the 4 years, but I don't know if you'll recognise any of those names. You can see we've got a couple of universities there that are involved, a couple of major aged care service providers, some kind of more cohort-specific organisations, and so we've been working really closely together on really working through a lot of the conceptual complexity of respite and how that works in Australia, especially because one of the unique features of being a carer organisation that works across all different caring roles and sectors of support is that most people in Australia will focus on the disability sector or the aged care sector or the mental health sector. But because we cover all of them, we really wanted to lead work that was looking at how respite's been dealt with in all of those sectors to sort of overcome some of the siloing that happens. And so it's been a very intellectually tough conversation between different perspectives and sectors to try and get a common understanding of what respite is hoping to achieve, how it's done it, and how we can kind of look at a bit of a common approach to how to re-embed those services in the current service system. And before I move on to Lucas, I just wanted to point out a couple of other studies, especially because Lucas will be talking about one that's not our biennial survey. So our 2016, 2018 and 2020 carer surveys have all looked at relevant topics that have informed this work. But also there is, and it's in the second last bullet point there, we also did a national survey specifically on respite needs to supplement this project on behalf of the other carer associations in 2016. And so Lucas will also be mentioning that, and it's a different survey, but still national. And I won't go through all the others in detail, but this is just some of the kind of foundational research of our founding members of the Carer Respite Alliance, and the actual references are at the end of the presentation in the slide if you want to follow those up. So that is some background, and next is over to Lucas to just talk you through high-level findings from our several surveys that have looked at respite. So thanks, Lucas.
Yes, hello, hope everybody can hear me. As Sarah said, I'm going to talk about our findings from the 2016 respite survey, which was a national survey we conducted, the 2018 New South Wales Carer Survey, and the 2020 National Carer Survey, sort of chronologically how we developed sort of our knowledge and how we tracked sort of the development in the respite sector in that regard. For some reason, I can't see any numbers on that slide, Sarah. Can you go back? Yeah, that's the file. I know that my printout actually has the numbers on it. That's a bit strange.
That is strange. I don't know why. Sorry, it did work in testing. I'll see if I can fix it.
Yeah, maybe if you restart the presentation from a close and open the file again, maybe that's the issue. Not to lose too much time, the big blob that you just saw on that slide was the division between those who never had, between those carers who never used any respite services and those who did. So in the National Respite Survey in 2016, we had a sample of 1,800 carers, demographically roughly fitting with what we know about the carer population in Australia. And yes, there's the numbers again. Great, thank you. And we found that 63% of our respondents back then had used respite at least once. So 63% has used some form of respite. 25% of all respondents, or that's 40% of those who actually used respite regularly. So the majority of those who have experience with using respite use it on basically one-off occasions or really not very often, put it that way. A number to bear in mind, because we will return to this later, is 6% of all respondents had used respite in an emergency or only in an emergency. So on the next slide, you will see we were trying to track how respite relates to care intensity and the condition of the care recipient. So what you see is how often respite has been used by how long the person the carer is caring for can be left alone. And we see that all the way to your left, if the person who's receiving the care can't be left alone at all, 30% of those who care for someone like this or whose caring situation is like that have never used respite. This grows to 55% of those who care for someone who can be left alone for one day have never used respite. So we see that while there is some uptake across all sort of forms of care intensity, that even among those with the highest care intensity, 30% have never ever used respite at all, which was quite a problematic finding in a way. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see that sort of this sort of really basic need was reflected in the understandings that carers bring to the issue of respite. What really stands out, so we were asking the question, in your opinion, what's the main purpose of respite, or in your experience, what's the main purpose of respite? And we see that the top three answers are everything that received more than 60% agreement is actually about the caring role. It's about giving just a short break from caring responsibilities, giving the opportunity to look after oneself, one's health and well-being, and definitely to keep sustaining the caring role. What is interesting is that as soon as we go to forms of that go beyond the really basics, like a holiday, only 40% said respite could be would have the purpose to allow the carer to take a holiday. And that's also important. Only 28% said that the purpose of respite for them was to be able to stay in work. So we see it's really about the basic sustaining of the caring role. If we continue to the next slide, I'm going to move on to what we found out about respite in 2018. So the first thing that was the first thing of note is that the uptake of respite actually, so it's a similar sample size. It's unlike the last one, however, focused on New South Wales only, and we see that the uptake is already dropped 10% from 63% to 53%. That might have a little bit to do with the sample composition, but it's a trend of note. We also see that the majority of those who take respite take it at least once a week, again connecting that to the condition of the care recipient. So in high intensity caring roles, there is access to respite, but as we saw in 2016, there's still a lot of lack covering the basics, even in very high intensity caring roles. What we also did because it's our own survey in 2018, and what we can see on the next slide, is to compare respite to other forms of carer service and to see how respite features compared to other forms of services provided to carers. And what we see there is that respite is the service type with the lowest sufficiency rating of all service types. So around 13% said they use respite as often as they need, whereas about 37% said they would have need of respite services that is not covered. This not covered need spans across all sort of high intensity forms of supports, especially around respite counseling, but interestingly also about support groups. The only type that fares a little bit better is online forums because they're cheap to run and very easily accessible. But we see that there must be some kind of barriers to all service types in that respect. And we looked a bit more in detail into that in 2020. In 2020, we did actually a national survey in cooperation with the carers associations from the other states and territories. Again, the sample demographics are roughly representative of the population of primary carers in Australia. So Sarah said before, so we try to compare that to the estimates given to us by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who run this population-wide survey every, I think 6 years it is, or 5 years. And sort of we fit quite well sort of in representing carers that have a relative high caring intensity. So now 2020, we had the great luck, or bad luck, that right during our survey field time, right while we conducted the survey, the first wave of COVID hit. And that, of course, influenced the availability of services, that influenced how services could be accessed. A lot of carers lost access to not just the respite service, but a lot of other service types. So we see that the need for all service types, again, except for online forums and groups, is very high, and that the uptake of respite has fallen from 63% in 2016 to 53% in 2018 to 13% for planned respite and 6% again for emergency respite in 2020. Now, a big issue around this was COVID, but on the next slide, we actually asked in a bit more detail about the challenges. What were the challenges to access various service types? And for those who have an unmet need in respite services, the challenges they identified were actually really around the basics of service provision. It was very difficult to find information. It was too arduous to organize. It was sort of not quite meeting the needs. There were long waiting periods. You know, it's basically a laundry list of very basic issues with service provision centered around not enough information and really, really cumbersome process of organization. What we revisited in 2020 on our next slide was sort of the need and the sort of where is the need and where's the meaning for respite grounded. And we found something very, very similar. We asked the question, how much do you agree with certain statements that describe how much you can actually use time for yourself. And the main finding was that the vast majority of carers really never get a mental timeout. They think about, regardless of what they do, more than 80% of carers, it's the first line on top, think about the needs of the person that they care for, regardless of where they are at the moment. And then we found that actually very worrying that 50%, more than 50% actually, can take just enough time out of the days and of their caring roles to keep going. So it's really about the need that we identified with this question is really about basic sustenance of the caring role. Going to the doctor, having a breather, just for a few hours, not having to provide care to another person. And we see that sort of with the more positively formulated items at the bottom. I'm able to take out enough time of my caring responsibilities to my own goals and interests, and I'm able to regularly take enough time from my caring responsibilities to properly relax and recuperate. They found an agreement level of just over 20%. What we drew from this sort of from 2016 to 2020, the level of need is really around the basics of the caring role. And we also saw that on the next slide. So we collect data about well-being. We use the Personal Wellbeing Index, which is an index of 7 dimensions across all domains of life. And we ask carers how they rate their satisfaction in these 7 domains. And we've got population level data. On average, the Australian, especially in these age cohorts, say, yeah, they're 75% satisfied with their life. It's a bit more even for the older cohorts, which are overrepresented among carers. And the first thing of note is that in our sample, sort of carers overall have a mean sort of well-being index score of 57%. Which is shocking if you really think about, yeah, barely over half satisfied with my life. And if you look at the effect of respite, and if we track sort of respite along these questions, we see that, again, it confirms that respite is really around basic needs and not around anything more, really. So we see that if people use planned respite, the satisfaction with their life is around 61%, which is really low compared to the general population, but it's a lot higher than the survey mean. And what is really sort of worrying is if people don't use respite. So if they articulate that they have an unmet need in terms of respite, their well-being really drops below 50%. I think the actual number is 47 point something, which really shows that why respite is important is because it satisfies these really basic needs. It's a service as much to the care recipient as to the carer, because if the carer doesn't get respite from the caring role becomes completely unsustainable. Yeah. I hope that walkthrough was interesting for you. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Melissa, who was the lead author of our paper and who will tell you a lot more detail what we did with this information.
Hi, so my name is Melissa. I'm a Policy and Development Officer here at Carers New South Wales. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the paper that we've been working on for, like Sarah said, approximately the last 4 years. And we're very excited that that paper will be launched next week. So I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of the paper and how that might relate to some of the work that you're doing or areas of interest. So firstly, the structure of the paper is separated into 3 sections. A brief history of respite in New South Wales, and then we look at the barriers and the effectiveness of respite, and then in the 3rd section we then look at the opportunities and recommendations and how to move forward. And some key features include the section and subsection summaries, which provide some really high-level information, quotes and case studies collected by Carers New South Wales over the period we were writing the report, and some findings from our Carers New South Wales Carer Survey, as well as our Respite Survey and some other surveys that we have conducted that have been conducted by our partners. So section 1 of the paper is the history of respite reform in New South Wales. And so as Sarah mentioned, for the last 10 years, following some significant inquiries into the carer sector, aged care and disability, 2009 and 2011, those big reports were released with some recommendations. There's been a big reform in Australia in how our services, our care services are delivered. And we thought it was really important to really break that down by sector to look at how that has impacted on how respite has been delivered, how it's changed, maybe where there are gaps emerging, or where services haven't been replicated, or also looking at maybe where there might have been increase to respite, or how respite might be framed. So these reviews that were back in 2009 and 2011 resulted in a shift to consumer-directed care models in the aged, disability and carer sector. However, this has seen often in the aged care and disability sector that the carers' needs, especially respite, have become secondary to the needs of those requiring care. So when when looking at carer needs, it's really been in relation to the services that the participant needs, or sorry, the person receiving care needs. I'm going to move on to the next one. So I've created a bit of a graphic to just kind of summarize some of the changes that have occurred in terms of how the services have been delivered. So if you just press the first one, Sarah. So in the disability services sector, we've gone from some state-funded services, which was all delivered by or funded by the New South Wales Department of Ageing, Disability and Home Care, to a national disability insurance, the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Care Gateway. Following the 2011 Productivity Commission inquiry, the National Disability Insurance Scheme was established with the aim of creating more person-centred, nationally consistent and more efficient disability services. It was rolled out in New South Wales between 2016 and 2018. And that's with the closure of the New South Wales Department of Ageing, Disability and Home Care. However, it's important to note that only 10% of people with disability in Australia, or approximately 400,000 Australians, are expected to be able to access support through the NDIS. So this means that 90% of people with disability in New South Wales won't be able to access the NDIS services. However, with the New South Wales Department of Ageing, Disability and Home Care also closing, there are no residual services for people with disability in New South Wales. And a lot of the carer services that were kind of associated with those disability services or provided respite within those programs have been transitioned to the Carer Gateway. In the aged care sector, so following the Productivity Commission back in 2011, My Aged Care was established. So that is a national service system, again, for people over 65 or for people over 50 if they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. This was established to create more choice and control and competition in the aged care sector. And previously, the services were delivered by New South Wales Department of Ageing, Disability and Home Care and the federal program. So there was a number of federal aged care programs as well. And these were also transitioned to My Aged Care. This was supposed to create a more consistent nationwide service system that was more easily accessible. And that transition occurred from approximately 2012 to 2015. And carer supports have also been transitioned to the Carer Gateway for carers of people who are ageing. Carer services. So carer services were delivered across a range of programs, both state and federally funded. As you can see, a large amount of those carer services were in scope for transition to those national service systems. However, it is really important to note, as I said before, that there are a number of people with disability who aren't able to access the NDIS. So for their carers, they are able to access services through the Carer Gateway. However, I guess as we'll speak a bit more to infer a bit further into in terms of respite, that can be quite limited as well. And the mental health sector. So in terms of mental health services, again, there was a range of programs that provided mental health supports, and there was a mental health respite carer support service. These have again been transitioned to the NDIS and Carer Gateway. Noting again that while the NDIS does provide supports for people with psychosocial disability, it still does expect that only 10% of people with disability will be able to access the NDIS for support. So again, that's another limitation for this group. And mental health care respite has been transitioned between the NDIS and the Care Gateway. And New South Wales Health does continue to provide the acute care services for mental health, but these services are often quite limited and Medicare and quite person-centered. So in terms of how that's changed respite delivery during these reforms, so we've seen in the disability sector, there's been a significant shift away from the term respite due to concerns that it may be pejorative to people with disability. Instead, people are opting to use more participant-centered language when referring to service types that may provide carers with a break, like social support or short-term accommodation. This has created some additional challenges for those with English as a second language, or those who may be less confident advocating, as they need to find other ways to phrase the respite supports that they need. There has been a recent reintroduction of respite into the NDIS terminology and the NDIS language, but we're still continuing to see there's a lot of difficulty for parents, especially of children with disability, but many carers, to access those respite type supports. And respite is defined to short-term accommodation. It's the only time it is actually used in the terminology. So in the price guide, so it is still quite difficult to for the NDIS to conceptualize what respite might look like outside of that. Also noting that it is a consumer-directed care system. So the supports for the carer must be framed in relation to the participant's goals and needs. There are no residual state-funded disability services in New South Wales. So for those carers who are caring for someone with a disability who can't access the NDIS, that makes things a little bit tricky. It does limit their options in terms of respite or respite-like support. In the aged care sector, it's been a little bit different. We've seen the traditional respite types kind of upheld and embedded in legislation, with residential respite, flexible respite, and cottage respite available service types. However, we've recently had the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, and it's really highlighted the limited assessment of carer needs in the aged care system. So while those service types are available, it's hard to actually determine when they're needed because there isn't that assessment of what they might need. And there's also limited availability due to the funding model. So it is still a capped funding model, and there are a number of people on wait lists in terms of getting some funding packages in their home. And where a person who's aging is on a wait list, there might not be enough funding available to them to be able to access services that provide respite for the carer. In the mental health sector, it's been a little bit different again. Mental health carers have unique respite needs. They often prefer retreat type respite options where they may, when a care recipient is mentally health, doing well, or in good mental health, they will take a break from the caring role. It often doesn't have a requirement for that respite, that direct care element for the person they care for. And mental health services have limited capacity, and so there are concerns that this hasn't been adequately replicated in some of those reforms and those changes in the systems, that mental health carers can no longer access some of those options, those respite options. And similar to the other sectors, the mental health service has limited capacity for carer-focused support. So it is focused heavily on, supports are focused heavily on the person that requires care and has limited availability of support for the carer. And in the carer support sector, it's the newest sector of reform. But we have seen that there is limited capacity for planned respite through the Carer Gateway. This is because it is expected that the other existing service systems will meet this service need. There's previous limited previous data of previous respite need, its use and effectiveness, and that's really made it difficult to understand what the future respite needs might be and to plan for that. And there's workforce shortages that are affecting all of the care sectors in Australia at the moment. So both the disability aged care sector are booming and growing, and this has placed some challenging demands on the care sector workforce. But this has also limited the ability for to access those workforces, that workforce to provide respite for carers. So section 2 of the paper looks at are respite services effective? So we've seen there's been a bit of a challenge, I guess, in some of the independent reviews of respite in Australia. And that's kind of where we wanted to highlight that effectiveness can be really difficult to measure. Respite is complex, both in terms of its modes of delivery and its definition, and that can make it difficult to evaluate the effectiveness. And similarly, the caring role is quite stressful, has high level of ongoing stress, and therefore measures might not be sensitive enough to capture the effectiveness of respite where it is accessed. So it requires really a review of both quantitative and qualitative data, and the evidence suggests that even though it is hard to evaluate the effectiveness, there can be a lot of positive outcomes of respite, including reduced level of burden, motivation, fatigue, sleep, improved mental health, increased life satisfaction and self-efficacy, as well as increased participation in social and economic activities. And the demand, so while the national data suggests that demand might be quite low for respite, it's important to note that while only 11.9% of primary carers in New South Wales reported needing respite, that still equates to 38,600 carers approximately. So it is still quite a lot of carers that are looking for more respite. And although most of the carers that said they hadn't used respite, so they didn't need it, it's not clear what lack of need means and whether that reflects a lack of appropriate services, a limited availability, or lack of awareness. And the data of the CRA, the Carer Respite Alliance, has really found that there's a higher demand than is captured in the SDAC. So as Lucas discussed, approximately 38% of people wanted to use more emergency respite and 40% wanted to use more planned respite in our carer survey. And we've heard anecdotally also from our carers that we support, as well as from our Carer Respite Alliance members, that the demand is actually quite high and there are many carers that can't access the respite that they need. So then we look at the barriers to respite. So maybe why is it that carers say there is a lack of need, and what are some of those real big challenges that are across sectors creating significant barriers to accessing the respite support? So we really broke down the qualitative data from our carer survey in 2018, as well as our 2020 survey, the anecdotal reports that we'd heard from Carer Respite Alliance and some other data sources to look at what are the barriers. So the main barriers, as you can see, are availability, awareness, accessibility, appropriateness, and affordability. And we go into those in quite detail in the paper and how they kind of sit across each service sector. And we also look at special groups and a range of additional barriers that they face, including stigma, discrimination, geographic isolation, and how those impact compoundingly on the access to respite for special needs or diverse groups of carers, such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander carers, LGBTIQ+ carers, or carers living in regional and remote areas. Section 3 of the paper, we look at where next for respite in New South Wales. So we really look at what are the opportunities moving forward, and this is where the paper really is handy in looking at the way forward and how we can expand what's available at the moment, as well as build on what is available. So at the moment, as Sarah mentioned, we are undergoing multiple sector reviews in Australia. We've had 2 major royal commissions, a productivity commission review, and the Carer Gateway is still in its very early stages. So there's some huge opportunities to see both system and legislative change, as well as changes to policy and some real big opportunities for system-wide improvement across all service sectors. But then we also look at opportunities outside of those established service systems and where we could be more innovative, or how we could look at things like people, places, and activities, and investment in those 3 areas to ensure there are adequate people, such as volunteers, or how we could invest in increasing the workforce around respite, as well as actual infrastructure that supports respite and activities. So both activities for the care recipient or the carer, and how those could be funded, or looking at more appropriate options. We also then go on to explore international examples. So that might be in America, we looked at volunteer respite models, philanthropic models. In New Zealand, there's a national respite strategy. In some European countries, there's cash for care systems. And we kind of have a look at how they may fit within the Australian the Australian context, and how we could easily possibly bring some more of those ideas in with minimal investment or targeted investment. The paper concludes with 68 recommendations, which is just a few. So we have very clear recommendations with tangible actions, and they're aimed at different areas. So we have recommendations aimed at the Australian government, the New South Wales government, the local governments, private sector and community sector. We acknowledge that, you know, it's likely that all areas will need to contribute in some ways, or have an opportunity to contribute or invest or explore how they could improve respite for carers. So we looked at across the board, what are the different things that each things at each level of government, as well as those in the private and community sector, could do to create change and improve access to respite for carers in New South Wales. So we're strategic action moving forward. So we're currently exploring ways to use the paper and the findings and the recommendations strategically, which might include joint letters to government, publishing joint articles with researchers and member organisations, conference presentations or webinars. And if there are any ideas about how we can share the findings, you know, we are open to, it'd be great to hear those as well, because we think there's a lot of value in them, in the paper and the work we've done in it. And in terms of the international context, so the paper and the work we've been doing, many of the challenges identified in our context are also similar in overseas contexts. We've identified some models of interest in other jurisdictions, but it would be really interesting to hear more insight and suggestions about some of those international examples, how they work, how they might work, and to explore those and flesh those out a bit more. And where evidence and best practice models can be leveraged for national and international advocacy. So like we said, opportunities to share the work we've been doing to try and advocate for more respite for carers across the board. And these are the references for the papers that Sarah mentioned at the start. So you can access those, and that's the kind of a lot of the evidence base that we've been working with.
I'm really conscious we haven't left any time for questions. But we maybe have like a minute or something, but I'll leave up. Very welcome to send questions to any of us via those email addresses. We can hang around now if anyone has any other questions. Sorry for taking up all your time.
Why don't we just take a minute for everyone just to thank our presenters so much for those who do have to go. And if you are able to stick around a little bit, we can keep things open, and those who have questions can stick around. But if everyone could just give a virtual round of applause or in the chat to thank our presenters for sharing all this great work that they're doing in Australia. It's just really great to see. And I can't wait to read the paper, especially the recommendations that you have. So thank you guys so much for being here tonight. I also just want to quick plug a reminder to make sure that you check out the Break Exchange and sign up if you have not done so already. And don't forget to check out the International Short Break Association conference as well. So with that, that'll officially end the webinar presentation, but definitely welcome to keep this open as long as the presenters are able, for those who want to stick around and engage in some questions and additional dialogue. So maybe Sarah, if you want to stop your screen share, then we can kind of see folks that are sticking around a little bit better, and that will help. Perfect. Great.
We did intend to leave time for questions, but as usual, we have so much to say that we took up the whole time. Sorry about that.
No problem. We may need to make these webinars longer too, I think. Great. Are there any questions from any of the people that have
question in the chat?
I saw one there about from C. Dinnell, when you say consumer directed, who is the consumer? So in the Australian context, the word consumers use in the aged care, disability and health sectors to really speak about the person with care needs. So there's a bit of a kind of there's some conversations that happen around the extent to which the carer is included in that, but generally it's consumer and carer. So it's the person with care needs.
Great. I actually have a question that I'll interject while we wait for others. I'm wondering, since the national survey was, you mentioned, sort of launched mid-COVID, did you have an opportunity to compare responses from those that were before lockdown to after within that response period? I'm just really curious to see.
All the responses were after the first, all the responses were during the first lockdown. So we lockdown started sort of end of March, if I remember correctly. And our field time was from April, May till the end of June. And the end of June was where restrictions first, I remember I went for my first hike at the beginning of July, which I'm really, really waiting for. That's when the national parks open again. So unfortunately not, but we do have a panel component in our survey now, and it will be interesting to see how this changes for the survey next year.
Great. And there's a question in the chat from Merle. If you want to unmute and ask that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we can just read it for you.
Sure, I'll talk. Thank you.
Great.
My perspective is a little different. I work for an outfit called Applied Self-Direction, so that I come to this very much from the consumer direction perspective and less from the respite perspective. So that when you say the move, but I have followed the NDIS process fairly closely. So that when you say that the move to consumer direction in Australia kind of left carers behind, can you talk a little bit about more what that looked like at a programmatic level, so that try not to make that mistake again?
Melissa, did you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Sarah can correct me if I get this wrong. No. So basically, I guess if we take the NDIS, for example, the NDIS, it's great. It's a participant-centered, person-centered model of care. It looks at an individual assessment. When we say assessment, a discussion with the individual with disability about their care needs, what their goals are, and what kind of supports they need to really help them with those goals. So their goals might be engaging in employment, living independently, or living where they continue to live, and looking at the supports that are needed, as well as what already exists within their support network. So, for example, a person with disability has a carer and has a person-centered plan developed for them, and they do have informal supports available to help them. But the support for the carer, so if the supports to actually support the carer, so respite, for example, so maybe it's another paid support worker coming into the home for a few days a week for a few hours to provide the carer with some time away from the caring role. It has to be framed in terms of the participant's goals. It can't be framed as the carer needs respite support, or it can't really be framed as the carer needs respite support. It needs to be framed as like the participant wants to, or an NDIS, a person accessing NDIS is referred to as a participant, sorry. So the participant wants to remain living at home, and what support do they need to do that? Well, they might need that support worker to come into the home to provide that care, but it's not framed in terms of the carer, it's framed in terms of the participant. And there's limited discussion around what the carer actually might need to continue to care and sustain that role. And that's where it's been a little bit tricky, because often it's in the interest of both the carer and the care recipient, but it does have to be framed in terms of the care recipient's needs or the participant's needs. So it's similar in the aged care sector, that there's limited opportunity to actually look at what does the carer need to continue to provide that informal support. And that's where it becomes really tricky.
That's very helpful. No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
I can also add to that. I think the NDIS is the best example, definitely, and I think it's been where carers have been marginalised the most. Aged care has been a bit less of a problem in that respect, but what it really comes down to, and what the Carer Respite Alliance has raised consistently in our discussions, has been the concept of the care dyad for carer and care recipient, or even more than one carer in a lot of cases, worked better when there were block funded services, because a unit, family unit, household unit, whatever the unit was, or the dyad, there was a service that was available in kind of an ongoing capacity that they would just come and access. Whereas because you're moving to the individual, it becomes very individualistic, and there's not really, I don't think it's been intentional most of the time, but it's very much focused on that person. And while it takes into account to some extent the people around them, there's kind of a consensus across the carer sector here that the carer has just been forgotten as part of that. And it really comes out in that word consumer, which we were asked about before, because this concept of a rational consumer in this individualistic context, whereas as we would all know, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, especially where care needs are really high, it's very hard to extricate the carer and the care recipient's needs and experiences. They really go together. So I think that's really what we're hoping to reintroduce, is this idea that sometimes the carer and the care recipient are actually one unit, and to ignore the needs of the carer in their own right is actually a real missed opportunity. And we do have, I mentioned earlier in the webinar that we haven't really talked to care recognition legislation, but at federal and at state level in Australia, we have some legislation that really spells out what care recognition should look like, and that really does push for the idea of carers' own needs in their own right. But we're seeing a disconnect between that and what service systems are actually doing, and there's some catching up that needs to happen around that.
This is Jill from Arch, and I have to say that's very similar to how programs are structured in the United States at the federal and state levels, that it's the care recipient who is the eligible person. And the caregiver is secondary to that. Though there has been increasing movement toward pushing and even legislating caregiver assessments for that person, independent from the care receiver. So we're starting to see some improvements in that area, some caregiver assessments being required in certain aspects of the Medicaid program, which is the largest source of federal funding for respite. And we also have a much smaller program called the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which for the first time this year is now requiring use of caregiver assessments. So we're starting very slowly to move in that direction. And there's just so many similarities between the barriers that you presented around accessing federal and state funding, barriers in the direct service workforce, barriers in accepting respite, that are just so similar. And I have to applaud all of you on the tremendous amount of work and the depth and breadth of the survey that you were able to conduct nationally. We don't have anything similar that focuses on respite. There are some organizations that have done caregiver surveys, but they usually just touch on respite. And don't really get into the depth of why our respite use is so low. I mean, you talked about the low usage of respite in Australia. The only national survey we have of caregivers that was done by private caregiving organizations found here in the US that only 14 to 15% of identified caregivers have used respite at any time. It might be a little bit higher in those caregivers who have a higher burden of care. So, that's very similar, but our barriers are huge as well. And so I really applaud all of the work that you've done to identify the issues. I'm really looking forward to seeing the report so I can see in more depth what your recommendations are. I mean, that's what I'm really excited about, and I can't wait to see that report. So thank you for all your great advocacy work there. It'll help us here too. So we're grateful for the presentation tonight.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Jill said too, and add that I made notes of two things that Jill touched on that I thought were really correlated with what we see in the US, that unmet need, low percentage. I did a secondary analysis of our National Survey of Children's Health 2 years ago, and we found that across a lot of service categories, the highest percentage of unmet need reported by family caregivers was 4%, which to me seems like that can't even be possible. Like I could talk to 10 people in my neighborhood who have kids with special needs and they'd all say they have unmet needs. So I'm wondering if there's some element of response bias in who is filling out these surveys, if it's people who are accessing services and are truly getting their needs met. And then I had a question about your slide that you presented, sort of the challenges that people said for accessing respite care. I'm wondering, did you code those from like narrative open-ended questions, or was it like they got the option to check what the challenges were in the survey?
We had an open question as well, but all these were tick marks. So click all that apply basically.
Okay.
Because we're doing the survey every 2 years, we have a good idea of what the options are. We still get a lot of other answers, but yes, so these were pre-written.
That stood out to me a lot because again, in our National Survey of Children's Health, in the years that it did ask literally one question about respite care in the whole survey, they did ask a follow-up to like, why did you have unmet respite care needs? And in that, again, they had sort of the usual like cost and access, but the most frequently selected response was other. Like 40% of families selected other. And so it's like, we're not even understanding like what are the big issues with unmet needs. And I just thought that was really interesting that you kind of found similar information. So great.
The sad thing about that too is that they're no longer even conducting that survey among children with special health care needs. So it's been maybe 8 or 10 years since we've had any data on respite among parents of children with special health care needs who use respite. We know nothing.
Yep, I know. I was we had one question, then it went away. Yeah. So yeah, and I do see there's a question in the chat. So from C. Dinell, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask that, or we can certainly read your question as well. Maybe they're not in.
This is Cheryl. I just had a couple of questions. Now that you are having some transitions in your systems, was there going to be any common data collection going forward across those systems so that you had comparisons of those populations or those groups?
Well, not really. So from the consumer side, we've got the Australian Bureau of Statistics does this big survey with about 20,000 households, the Survey of Disability Aid and Care, which we use as a reference population, which is the most reference. That goes into not that much detail, and it's sort of, I think, also underestimating the amount of carers, but that goes across all systems. Our survey goes across all systems, and in our survey we actually link specifically to sort of which system they consume, and they can of course consume in all systems now that we use this language. Other than that, sort of in terms of data that the service systems themselves collect, that is very much siloed and very much separate. They do publish reports, but there is very little information about the overlap. And in theory, these systems are designed not to overlap. But of course, in some way or form or fashion, they do. And as Melissa explained before, the result is that a lot of services just drop out, and a lot of people just drop out and don't have access to any of the services because they're in a overlapping or very, very niche. Not very niche, because they're because they have a condition or needs that aren't met by any of the systems specifically.
And so data. Oh no, you're probably going to say what I was going to say, Melissa. Go for it.
I was going to say it's really been highlighted in those recent reviews, the lack of respite data that has been collected in the mental health sector. It was noted that there wasn't much data collected on how the mental health respite carer support service was utilised, who was using it, how that was being used. In the aged care system, there are elements that there's no respite data recorded. So those have been highlighted in systems themselves that need to look at how they collect that respite data to ensure that it is actually capturing the services that are being provided, the outcomes of those. The Carer Gateway does provide an opportunity to collect data, measure outcomes from specific services. But in terms of that across system data, it's still quite siloed. And it is something that we've tried to, really encourage that sharing of data and information so that there is a clear picture, because some people are accessing two service systems. They're caring for an older person and a young person with disability. So there needs to be some level of consistency in information sharing to better understand those needs.
It's actually been very rare. It's been very rare in Australia for respite to be looked at as an overarching service type across service systems. And so we're not the first to do it. One of our research teams that is part of the Care Respite Alliance had previously done a paper that we included in the reference called Transitioning Australian Respite, where they looked at more than one system. I don't think they looked at mental health, they looked at disability and aged care. And so our paper is kind of one of very few that actually looks at respite as a concept in the different service systems. And so because of that, so there's not really an understanding that's building now, but there hasn't really been an understanding at policy, funding, data collection level that it's kind of the same thing across the different sectors because it has developed differently. So I think we and others, and including others on our Care Respite Alliance, have really been pushing that in the Royal Commissions, and it has really been picked up, especially in the Aged Care Royal Commission. And so I think we're seeing some progress in that, but data is a big recommendation that we've made a lot. I think it's kind of under consideration at the moment how on earth that could be done. But even if there's will to do it, it's going to be very difficult because we have completely separate departments. So the aged care services for over 65s are managed by the Department of Health at federal level, and the NDIS and Carer Gateway are managed by the Department of Social Services. And there's a sort of a brick wall in between, different ministers, different budgets. So they work together a lot, but there's just some huge barriers, and they're working on them. It's really been highlighted under the Royal Commissions, but really how you practically get around that is difficult. And I think the most promising kind of development out of the Aged Care Royal Commission, which published a final report a couple of months ago, was a clear recommendation that really was similar to what we advocated for in our submissions to the Royal Commission, a clear recommendation to information share between the aged care system and the Carer Gateway. So that's been recommended to the government. The government response to those recommendations is still forthcoming. So we really anticipate, how that's going to be addressed, and we will be holding governments to account on those recommendations. It's kind of a bit of a work in progress. So it's not happening, and it will be very hard to make it happen, but I think there's movements towards that.
Ray Kirk is on the call here. I don't know if he's still listening, but this reminds me of a conversation he and I had when I shared my dream I had of having common data elements and consistent data collection across the country around respite outcomes. And he kind of laughed at me like, good luck. So,
I don't know if you're all familiar with, I don't know if you're all familiar at all with the teeny little program that we are very involved with here. It's the Lifespan Respite Care Program. And when that program was conceived, that was the intent, to start to break down silos at the state and federal level around respite, because we have even more agencies that have their own respite programs, their own definitions of respite, their own ways of collecting data, their own eligibility requirements. And so the lifespan approach was meant to start to engage conversations across agencies, across service sectors. But the program's never been funded at the level that we initially envisioned it. And while we have some great things happening at the state level, where states have these lifespan respite grants, and they may be able to start building those coordinated systems at the state level, we're years away from a federal national effort to do that. But we'd be very happy to share with you the promising models that we've had at the state level around building these coordinated systems of respite services. Again, even those are small models, again, because the funding is so limited, but we do have some examples that might be helpful to you, especially as you were talking about wanting to look for international models of innovation. That's another area where we've been collecting information. Susan Summers, who's on the call, has led that effort to do a national call for innovative and exemplary respite services that may be outside of the formal service system as well. So it deals with two of the issues that you talked about, innovation and exemplary, and also looking to the informal service sector for respite supports as well. So we've been starting to collect a lot of interesting models, and we'd be happy to share all of that with you if it would be helpful.
Definitely very interested in that. And I think, you know, we were saying, I think before the official recording started, while there's some big differences in the US and Australian kind of policy and political environment, and in many ways we're more aligned to sort of the other Commonwealth countries in the UK and Canada and things like that. There's the biggest similarity is the federalism issues and the state autonomy. That's really challenging. But I think what's most appealing to us about the US system to look at for examples is because there's some barriers around the established service systems and funding, looking outside of that to how we can work with more philanthropic components, which are obviously more developed in the US than to other places. So I think particularly that area, but yeah, definitely very interested. And we have looked at the Arch stuff in preparing the paper to some extent, but obviously it'd be great to actually talk with those involved in it in more depth. And we actually also were thinking, you know, we should look into sort of maybe publishing some things together, comparing some of the models. So if anyone's interested in doing some actual joint work, now that this paper that's taken 4 years to write is finished, Melissa will have plenty of time on her hands to write some more publications on it. Definitely interested.
But another major initiative that Ray, who's also on this call, has led is our effort to build the evidence base for respite by encouraging more research, you know, academic type research, specifically on, you know, models that maybe we know already have some promise, but just haven't been scaled up and replicated. But we really need to have that evidence. It's like, you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? If we don't have the data, we can't get the funding. If we don't have the funding, we can't build the services. So we have a major research initiative going on as well to encourage more researchers to participate with us.
That's great. I think something that's a real benefit for us, particularly in New South Wales, we have a state government that is very on the front foot with carer recognition, and the way that our sort of system works is there's a lot of funding for peak organisations, and there's a lot of funding that goes towards research and advocacy. And so I guess we've been privileged, unlike most of our carer associations in other parts of the country, we've been privileged to have that seed funding for research ongoing, which gives us the capacity to, you know, where we see that there's no data, we'll just collect it ourselves. And, you know, we run a pretty narrow, like we haven't got that many of us working on it, and we work on a lot, but I think that's been the benefit of just having that bit of research funding from the government.
No, that's wonderful. I'm very jealous.
Yeah. Well, we're sharing our data with you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
I wish we had more people on the call, but I think it's just the time issue.
Of course, and look, we really appreciate. We know it's the evening there, and you know, it's probably, we appreciate you doing it at a time that's not, you know, crack of dawn for us.
Yeah, we'll share the recording very widely with our national network. Make sure they learn from the great data you've collected.
And we'll be doing, so we are doing a national webinar to launch the paper next Tuesday. And at that point, we'll be launching it officially. And we'll also be doing a sort of short form overview kind of document, executive summary that's looks a bit flashier. And so as those come out, I know we said to Rachel, we'll send them through as soon as they're available so that you can circulate them and yeah, share them.
Wonderful. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your morning here, but it's so great to talk with you, and I feel like when you guys open your borders, I'm gonna have to come and visit, and we'll talk about all the great opportunities for collaborating. But really wonderful to hear from you. Thank you to everyone for your great discussion. This is what the Break Exchange is all about, and making those connections, and we will continue to stay in touch. And again, thank you for being here.
Fantastic. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.